Hello. Today I am simulating the past, like very past, like the beginning of humanity in Minecraft. Let's go. So back then, and they were not exactly called humans. They were like these monkey creatures that developed over time to have sapient, like the human type of behaviors. But right now we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about what they were in the past. So just resemble them. Back then, they were like primates, creatures. However, eventually they started to develop. They lost their tail, and they got the opposable thumb. Now later on, they started to make groups like this. Well, close enough. And then eventually they started to become nomadic. However, that's thousands of years later. But then they also lived in caves. And a historical fact for historians here: they put these sort of cotton curtains, so then they didn't get cold in the night. But right now we're not talking about that one. Anyway, so eventually they started to invent stone tools. This resembles this stuff. No, we're just gonna put something that resembles a stone tool. For instance, but like they were not exactly. Actually, the first tools weren't exactly tools. They were, well, sharp rocks. You didn't have to cut me off. We were nothing. Sharp rocks but they were still useful. Eventually, they started to hunt. Eventually, they started to learn how to make some more dangerous tools to hunt more of the dangerous creatures. For instance, mammoths. Mammoths were huge furry looking creatures, but they're extinct now. But it's because of the end of the Ice Age. You don't need to, but they were massive creatures in their time, and they were pretty hard to take out. But once you take out, worthiness. You don't need the details. I'm gonna just do this. Anyways, so going on with the fact that humans hunted these creatures. Humans started to hunt these creatures for the weather and food. Sometimes they succeeded in taking them out, and sometimes this is when they succeed. They die. The animal dies. However, when they don't succeed, they die. Everyone knows that part. However, their more uses were for that. Okay. Stand was to make back then leather, pretty much like leather stuff, like this. However, eventually they started when time continued processing, time continued moving, and eventually the cave thing started to not work anymore, and eventually just gone away. So eventually housing was invented. This resembles housing. However, but before they were not exactly big cities or communities. They were actually small communities like this. I get the idea. And eventually farming was invented. And that made things more easier for them. Very easy for the people who just pretty much had trouble finding the food. And actually, they don't need to go out more often. Now they can just get the wheat from here. And now, anyways, so as time went on, these tiny communities grew and grew. They started to get surplus. It means a more amount that they need, and eventually the village started to grow, or the communities started to grow into towns. The first stone houses eventually were invented back in the day. I can't give precise dates because I don't want to be wrong. So anyways, eventually these towns became cities. The first cities were found in Mesopotamia, in the round of the Middle East area. However, though, eventually people started to fight for things now, like selfish humans we are now. These are one group. Just for reference, here's this example. This group, the white tribe, is fighting the yellow tribe, for instance, to defend their farm, because back then there were still nomads back then, and this were like the advanced group. However, these are the primitive group that still do nomadic hunting. As you see now, they're nomads. Well, they were living in cities. However, as time changed, the nomads were completely gone in this time period frame. Anyway, so years went by. Eventually, finally, people started to learn how to work with bronze, and then, but first they started to use with copper. That was their early version, but eventually copper, and then, anyways, copper was used first as a weapon. They were used for making weapons, pretty much. However, eventually, and then they made them stronger against their foes and enemies. And eventually, they started to learn how to work. Eventually, they made the alloy, aka actually known as bronze. Eventually, it's over time, people started to learn how to make tactics, and that's when things became interesting in time, because eventually, people wanted to have land. This resembles a battle happening. Eventually, the old towns and stuff like that eventually started to go missing, like just been conquered by other peoples. For instance, like I don't know, just making an example here. For instance, the white tribe gets conquered by the yellow group. I mean, the white country gets conquered by the yellow group, and now as conquest goes on, they conquer the land like this. So eventually, though, as more time passed by, and eventually humans started to learn how to actually, no, that was a lot earlier, but farming, like breeding animals. Like, okay, let's just make an example. Actually, the first animals that were officially ever tamed, the white again represents goats. Goats here. Eventually, then they started to learn how to cage them, but I think that was later time. Maybe I was confused. And now here we are farming. They started to learn how to breed animals. Eventually, though, things got more complicated over time. See, when humans eventually started to learn how to fight, they learned how to get complicated things. And don't forget, but then more notorious weapon came around: bow and arrows. And let me just simulate the more catastrophic thing about this thing. Imagine, let's just say, an average group of these 4 people are just found this group of other people that were just simply walking by, unnoticing them, and so they can just simply launch a volley of arrows, and that's how devastating that really was in that time. However, as time went on, pretty much, things got to make it more interesting. There eventually, culture was invented, or culture is and not more advanced. There were politics now. There were these forms of government. For instance, Mesopotamia, I think, had these group of elder people. The yellows represent the elder people. Or actually, no, that was Babylon. But right now, we're just giving an example here. They're a group of people that control daily lives of people. Good. So eventually, as time went on, humans got developed, and yada yada yada. Time wasn't, and then eventually, at some point, humans started to work with iron, or look, and then these Sea Raider people came from the other side here. But we don't know. They started to raid the other town. For instance, Egypt was destroyed. Egypt was attacked by the sea people before in the past, and eventually, a lot of the civilizations, ancient civilizations, were wiped out because of the sea people. Eventually, barbarian people. But still, we don't know how that happened. But it was wiped out. Anyway, so they came. They took out pretty much a lot of the ancient civilizations, but some of them survived and made new ones. So that pretty much wraps up today's episode of History of Minecraft. Thank you for watching.